The wagon wheels creaked a steady rhythm across the Kansas prairie as Margaret Donovan clutched her sister's wedding dress to her chest, watching the endless grassland roll past under the September sun of 1878. She had never imagined she would be wearing Caroline's beautiful ivory silk gown, never dreamed she would be the one traveling west to marry a stranger named William Hartwell, who lived on a homestead somewhere beyond the horizon. Caroline was supposed to be the bride. Beautiful, charming Caroline with her golden hair and easy laugh, who had corresponded with William for 8 months through carefully written letters. But 3 days before the wedding, Caroline had run away with the banker's son from their hometown of Independence, Missouri, leaving behind only a hastily scrawled note and a family scandal that threatened to ruin them all. At 23, Margaret was considered the practical daughter, the one who kept house for their widowed father and managed the household accounts with quiet efficiency. She was pretty in a gentle way, with auburn hair and gray eyes that reflected intelligence rather than flirtation, but she had always lived in Caroline's shadow when it came to matters of romance and marriage. "You have to go in her place," their father had declared when Caroline's betrayal became clear. "William Hartwell is expecting a bride, and he's already sent money for the journey. If we don't fulfill this obligation, word will get out about Caroline's behavior, and no decent man will have either of you." So here Margaret sat, dressed in her sister's abandoned wedding gown, traveling toward a marriage with a man who had never seen her face and knew nothing of her existence. The driver of the wagon, a weathered frontiersman named Jake Morrison, had been told only that there had been a change in plans regarding which Donovan daughter would be making the journey. "Almost there now." "Miss!" Jake called back to her as they topped a rise that revealed a modest log cabin nestled in a grove of cottonwood trees. "That there's the Hartwell place." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as she studied what was to become her new home. The cabin was small but well built, with a stone chimney and glass windows that spoke of care and permanence. A barn and several outbuildings suggested a working farm, and she could see cattle grazing in the distance. Everything looked neat and prosperous, the kind of place where a careful man might build a life. As the wagon approached the cabin, a tall figure emerged from the doorway. William Hartwell was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair and broad shoulders that spoke of physical labor. He wore clean clothes and moved with the confident stride of someone comfortable with his place in the world. But it was the small figure that appeared beside him that caught Margaret's attention and held it. A little girl of perhaps 5 years old stood at William's side, her blonde hair in neat braids and her blue eyes bright with curiosity. She wore a clean pinafore over a simple dress, and there was something about her serious expression that tugged at Margaret's heart immediately. William approached the wagon with obvious anticipation, his face showing the mixture of nervousness and excitement that any man might feel when meeting his bride for the first time. But his expression changed to confusion when he looked up at Margaret, clearly noting that she was not the woman in the photograph Caroline had sent months earlier. "I'm sorry," he said politely, "but I think there's been some mistake. I'm William Hartwell, and I'm expecting my bride, Miss Caroline Donovan." Margaret's throat felt dry as she prepared to deliver the explanation she had rehearsed during the long journey. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm Margaret Donovan, Caroline's sister. There were complications that prevented Caroline from making the journey. My father sent me in her place with the hope that you might find the arrangement acceptable." William stared at her for a long moment, clearly trying to process this unexpected development. "Complications," he repeated carefully. "Caroline chose to marry someone else," Margaret said quietly, deciding that honesty was better than elaborate explanations. "She left rather suddenly, and my father felt that you deserved to have a bride as promised, even if it couldn't be the specific woman you had been corresponding with." The little girl tugged on William's sleeve, looking up at him with concerned eyes. "Papa, who is the pretty lady? Why does she look sad?" William glanced down at his daughter, then back at Margaret, his mind clearly racing through the implications of this situation. "This is Grace," he said finally, putting a protective hand on the child's shoulder. "She's my daughter." Margaret managed a smile for the little girl, despite the awkwardness of the situation. Hello, Grace, I'm Margaret. You have very pretty braids. Grace studied Margaret with the frank assessment that only children possessed. Are you going to be my new mama? Papa said a mama was coming to take care of us. The innocent question hung in the air between the three adults, highlighting the complexity of their situation. William had been expecting to marry Caroline, but he had clearly told his daughter that a new mother was coming. Margaret had come prepared to marry a stranger, but that stranger had every right to reject her in favor of the woman he had actually chosen. Miss Donovan, William said carefully, perhaps you should come inside so we can discuss this situation properly. Jake, would you mind waiting while we sort things out? Take all the time you need, the wagon driver replied, settling back in his seat. I've got nowhere else to be today. The interior of the cabin was simple but comfortable, with handmade furniture and feminine touches that suggested Grace's mother had lived here not too long ago. A rocking chair sat near the fireplace, and Margaret could see children's toys arranged neatly in one corner. Please, sit down, William said, gesturing toward the kitchen table. Grace, why don't you play with your dolls for a few minutes while Miss Donovan and I talk? Grace obediently went to her toys, but Margaret could see that the child was listening to every word of the adult conversation with the intense attention that children showed when they sensed something important was happening. Mr. Hartwell, Margaret began, I want you to know that I understand how unusual this situation is. My sister behaved very badly, and I know you have every right to send me back where I came from. I won't blame you if you decide you want nothing to do with any member of the Donovan family. William studied her face, taking in the quiet dignity with which she was handling an embarrassing and difficult situation. What did your father tell you about me before you agreed to come here in your sister's place? He told me that you were a widower with a young daughter, that you had a successful homestead, and that you were looking for a wife who could help you raise Grace and manage a household. He also said that Caroline's letters described you as a kind and honorable man. And what did Caroline tell you about the reasons she wanted to marry me? Margaret hesitated, unsure how much honesty this situation could bear. I think Caroline saw marriage to you as an adventure, a chance to escape small-town life and see something of the frontier. I don't think she fully understood what it meant to be a wife and mother. And you do. I've been managing my father's household since my mother died 6 years ago, Margaret said simply. I know what it means to take care of a family, to make a home comfortable and welcoming, to put other people's needs before your own desires. William was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing her words against his own expectations and needs. Miss Donovan, can I ask you a personal question? Of course. Why did you agree to come here? Why were you willing to marry a complete stranger just because your sister decided she didn't want to? Margaret considered how to answer honestly without sounding either desperate or calculating. Because Grace needs a mother, she said finally, glancing toward the little girl who was pretending to feed her doll while clearly listening to every word. Because you need a partner to help you build the life you're trying to create here. And because I wanted the chance to have a family of my own. You've never been married? No. I've had suitors, but none who seemed interested in the kind of partnership I hoped for in marriage. Most men wanted either an ornament to display or a servant to wait on them. Very few seemed to want an actual partner. William glanced toward Grace, who had abandoned all pretense of playing and was now openly watching their conversation with wide, hopeful eyes. Grace, he said gently, come here for a minute. The little girl approached the table with the careful steps of someone who sensed that important decisions were being made. William lifted her onto his lap, and she immediately snuggled against him with the easy affection of a much-loved child. Sweetheart, William said. What do you think of Miss Margaret? Grace studied Margaret with serious blue eyes, taking in everything from her travel-worn clothes to her gentle expression. She has kind eyes, Grace said finally. And she smells like flowers like Mama used to. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes at the innocent observation. She had dabbed a bit of lavender water on her wrists that morning, hoping to make a good impression on her intended husband. Do you think she could be a good mama for you? William asked his daughter. Grace nodded emphatically. I think God sent her instead of the other lady because he knew we needed her more. The simple faith in the child's words seemed to settle something in William's mind. He looked at Margaret with new consideration, seeing not just a substitute for the woman he had been expecting, but a person in her own right who might be exactly what his family needed. Miss Donovan, he said formally, I'll be honest with you. I had developed certain expectations about Caroline based on our correspondence. I thought I knew what kind of woman I was going to marry. But looking at you now, listening to how you've handled this difficult situation with grace and honesty, I'm beginning to think Grace might be right. About what? Margaret asked softly. About God knowing better than we do what we actually need. William set Grace gently on the floor and stood to face Margaret directly. I'm not going to pretend this isn't an unusual situation or that it doesn't come with complications. But if you're willing, I'd like to marry you, Margaret Donovan, not as a substitute for your sister, but as yourself. Margaret felt her heart lift with a hope she hadn't dared to acknowledge. You're sure you don't need time to think about it? I'm sure, William said firmly. Grace needs a mother who will love her for herself, not someone who sees her as an obligation or an inconvenience. You're already looking at her like she matters to you personally. That tells me more about your character than any letter could. She does matter to me, Margaret said, looking down at the little girl who was watching this exchange with obvious delight. I've wanted children of my own for years, and she's already starting to feel like my daughter. Grace clapped her hands together with joy. Does that mean you're going to stay? Does that mean you're going to be my mama? If you'll have me, Margaret said, kneeling down to Grace's level. I know I'm not the lady you were expecting, but I promise you that I will love you and take care of you as if you were my own daughter. I want you to stay, Grace said solemnly, throwing her small arms around Margaret's neck. I prayed every night for a mama who would love Papa and me, and you came in a pretty white dress just like I imagined. Margaret held the little girl close, feeling a wave of protective love that surprised her with its intensity. This child had been motherless for who knew how long, and the longing in her embrace spoke of a deep need for feminine affection and guidance. Then it's settled, William said with satisfaction. Jake, you can tell folks in town that there will be a wedding here tomorrow afternoon. Miss Donovan, I hope you don't mind a simple ceremony. We don't have much time to plan anything elaborate. Simple is perfect, Margaret replied, though her mind was already racing through all the preparations that would need to be made. Grace, would you like to help me get ready for the wedding? Yes, Grace said emphatically. Can I help you with your hair, and can I pick flowers for you to carry? I would love that, Margaret said, charmed by the child's eagerness to be involved in the wedding preparations. That evening, as Margaret helped Grace prepare for bed in the small bedroom they would soon share, the little girl chattered excitedly about all the things they would do together as mother and daughter. Will you teach me to braid my hair in new ways? Grace asked, as Margaret brushed out her blonde locks. And will you show me how to cook, and can we plant a flower garden in the spring? Yes, to all of those things, Margaret promised. What else would you like to do? Grace was quiet for a moment, then looked up at Margaret with serious eyes. Will you love Papa the way my first mama did? I don't remember her very well. But Papa gets sad sometimes when he thinks I'm not watching. The question revealed a depth of understanding that was remarkable in such a young child. Grace had clearly been observing her father's grief and wondering whether this new woman would be able to heal the sadness that lingered in their home. I will do my best to make your Papa happy, Margaret promised. I can't replace your first mama, but I hope I can bring new happiness to both of you. I think you will, Grace said with the confidence of childhood. You already make Papa smile more than he has in a long time. The next day brought neighbors from miles around to witness the wedding of William Hartwell and his unexpected bride. Margaret wore Caroline's wedding dress, altered quickly to fit her smaller frame, and carried a bouquet of prairie wildflowers that Grace had gathered at dawn. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, conducted by the circuit preacher who happened to be making his rounds through the area. But what made it memorable was the obvious joy of the small family being formed. and the way Grace stood between her father and new mother, holding both their hands as if to make sure they stayed connected. "Do you, William, take Margaret to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," William said, looking into Margaret's eyes with an expression that suggested he was beginning to see her not as a substitute, but as a gift he hadn't known he needed. "Do you, Margaret, take William to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Margaret replied, meaning every word of the ancient promise. "Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife. William, you may kiss your bride." When William leaned down to kiss Margaret, it was with gentle reverence rather than passionate romance, but she felt the sincerity behind it. In his brown eyes, she saw not disappointment at having received someone other than who he'd expected, but gratitude for what he had actually received. Grace cheered and threw flower petals in the air, declaring to everyone within hearing that her new mama was the most beautiful bride in the whole world. The months that followed established patterns that would define their marriage for years to come. Margaret threw herself into her role as wife and mother with wholehearted dedication, managing the household with quiet efficiency, while slowly earning William's respect and affection through her practical competence and genuine care for his daughter. Grace bloomed under Margaret's nurturing attention, becoming more confident and outgoing as she learned to trust that this new mother would indeed stay and love her as promised. The little girl's natural intelligence flourished under Margaret's patient teaching, and her laughter began to fill the cabin with the kind of joy that had been missing since her birth mother's death. William, for his part, found himself falling in love with the woman who had come to him by accident but seemed designed by Providence to be exactly what he and Grace needed. Margaret's steady strength complemented his own nature perfectly, and her obvious devotion to Grace won his heart more thoroughly than any romantic gesture could have done. He told her one evening as they sat on the front porch watching Grace play with a kitten she had found. "I've been thinking about Caroline." Margaret stiffened slightly, still sensitive about the circumstances that had brought her to this marriage. "What about her?" "I'm grateful to her," William said, reaching over to take Margaret's hand. "If she hadn't run away with that banker's son, I never would have met you. I never would have known what I was really looking for in a wife." "And what were you looking for?" Margaret asked softly. "Someone who would love Grace like her own daughter. Someone who would see our family as a blessing rather than a burden. Someone who would be my partner in building something lasting and beautiful." He squeezed her hand gently. "Someone exactly like you. Even though I wasn't the woman in the photograph, even though you never chose me specifically. Especially because of that," William said with conviction. "Caroline might have been prettier or more charming, but you were exactly what we needed, even if we didn't know it at the time." The years that followed brought both challenges and joys, as all marriages do. Margaret and William welcomed 3 more children together, but Grace was never made to feel less special or loved. She grew up understanding that families could be formed in unexpected ways, and that the strongest bonds were often those created by choice rather than chance. When Grace was 16 and preparing to marry a young man from a neighboring homestead, she asked Margaret to help her choose fabric for her wedding dress. "I want it to be like yours was," Grace said, fingering a bolt of ivory silk in the general store. "I want to look as beautiful as you did when you married Papa." "Sweetheart," Margaret said gently, "you know that wasn't originally my dress. It belonged to your Aunt Caroline." "I know," Grace said with the wisdom of someone who had grown up hearing the true story of how her family had been formed. "But it became yours when you wore it to marry Papa, just like you became my real mama when you chose to love me." "You never felt like I was a substitute or a replacement." Grace looked at her with surprise. "Mama Margaret, you were never a substitute for anything. You were God's answer to my prayers, sent at exactly the right time in exactly the right way. The fact that you came instead of someone else just proves that God knew better than any of us what our family needed. Margaret felt tears gather in her eyes as she embraced this young woman who had become her daughter in every way that mattered. "I love you so much, Grace. You and your father saved me from a life I never knew I didn't want. And you saved us right back," Grace replied. "Papa always says the best things in life come disguised as accidents, but I don't think you were an accident at all. I think you were always supposed to be our mama. You just took the long way around to get to us." The story of Margaret's unexpected arrival became part of local folklore, told and retold as an example of how God's plans often worked in mysterious ways. But for Margaret, William, and their children, it was simply the story of how a family had been formed not by careful planning or romantic attraction, but by the willingness of three people to open their hearts to unexpected possibilities. Margaret's wedding dress was carefully preserved and passed down through the family, worn by daughters and daughters-in-law who understood that it represented not just one woman's dreams, but the beginning of a legacy built on the understanding that love could be chosen as well as felt, that families could be created by decision as well as by birth, and that sometimes the most beautiful stories began with the words, "God sent you after all." In the end, Caroline's betrayal had been not a disaster, but a blessing in disguise, freeing William and Grace to find in Margaret something far more precious than the romance they thought they wanted. A love built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the daily choice to care for each other through whatever challenges life might bring. If this story of unexpected blessings, found family, and love that grows from choice rather than chance touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need to be reminded that sometimes our greatest disappointments lead to our most beautiful discoveries. Your support helps these stories reach others who may be walking through their own seasons of uncertainty, showing them that God's plans are often better than our own, and that the most profound love stories sometimes begin not with passion, but with the simple willingness to open our hearts to unexpected possibilities. Thank you for believing in the transformative power of choosing to see divine purpose in life's surprising detours.